Shave it all off, my mother said while the barber tied the black cape around my neck. If Madison has to lose her hair, you don't deserve to keep yours. I was 16 years old, sitting under the bright salon lights at a strip mall outside Columbus, Ohio, staring at myself in the mirror while chunks of my blonde hair slid silently onto the floor. My father stood near the front counter pretending to scroll through his phone. My older sister Madison sat beside him wearing a pink knit beanie over the thin patches left from chemotherapy. Everyone in that salon looked at her with sympathy. Nobody looked at me at all. "Please," I whispered, my fingers gripping the armrest so tightly my knuckles hurt. I already cut it short for her. "Isn't that enough?" My mother crossed her arms. Even now, I still remember the exact shade of lipstick she wore that afternoon. Dark red. The color she always wore when she wanted to feel important. "Your sister is fighting for her life," she snapped. "And you're crying over hair." The barber hesitated before turning the clippers on. The buzzing sound filled my chest like panic. Madison looked down at her lap and said nothing. I wanted someone to stop it. My father. My sister. Anyone. But the only sound was the hum of the clippers and my mother's irritated sigh every time I started shaking. 2 weeks earlier, Madison had been diagnosed with leukemia. Overnight, our house turned into a place where fear sat at every dinner table and every conversation ended in tears. I understood she was sick. I understood everyone was scared. What I didn't understand was why my family suddenly looked at me like I had become the problem. Before the diagnosis, my mother used to call me her sunshine girl because of my long blonde hair. She braided it before school dances. She posted pictures of it online. Then Madison started losing hers, and somehow my hair became something shameful. Something selfish. "It's only fair," my mother kept saying. "Your sister shouldn't suffer alone." But sitting there in that salon chair, I realized this was never about fairness. This was about punishment. The first lock fell across the cape like spilled gold. Then another. Then another. I stared at my reflection as my face slowly changed into someone I didn't recognize. Without my hair, my cheeks looked rounder. My eyes looked too big. Vulnerable. The barber worked carefully, almost gently, like he knew this wasn't my choice. When he finally finished, he handed me a small mirror so I could see the back of my head. I didn't take it. My mother smiled for the first time all afternoon. "There," she said softly. "Now you look how you should have looked all along." Even Madison lifted her head at that. Her expression tightened slightly, like she wanted to say something but didn't. On the drive home, nobody spoke. I sat in the back seat wearing my hoodie despite the July heat, pressing my forehead against the window while the air conditioning blasted across my bare scalp. We stopped at a red light beside a school bus full of kids coming home from summer camp. One little girl pointed at me through the glass, then quickly looked away. I pulled the hood lower over my face and stared down at my trembling hands. That was the moment I understood something I wouldn't fully admit for years. My sister had cancer. But my mother hated me long before the diagnosis. The worst part was not losing my hair. It was watching how quickly everyone stopped seeing me as a person after it was gone. By the end of summer, our entire house revolved around Madison's treatments, Madison's medications, Madison's favorite foods, Madison's moods. Nurses came and went carrying soft voices and clipboards. Neighbors dropped casseroles at the front door. Churchwomen sent handwritten cards covered in glitter crosses and promises to pray for her recovery. Every room smelled faintly of disinfectant, chicken soup, and the lavender candles my mother kept burning in the kitchen like they could somehow purify the fear hanging over all of us. I tried to stay invisible. That became my role. Madison was the sick daughter. My mother was the exhausted caretaker. My father was the quiet provider working extra hours at the insurance office downtown. And me? I became the extra body in the hallway. The girl who cleaned dishes without being asked. The girl who folded laundry at midnight, while everyone else slept. The girl who stopped speaking unless spoken to first. School started again in late August, and I learned very quickly that people stared longer when you were bald and trying to pretend you were not. Some kids assumed I had cancer too. Others whispered cruel things when they thought I could not hear them. One boy in my chemistry class asked if I had joined a cult. Another girl laughed and told me I looked like a thumb wearing sneakers. I started eating lunch in the library because it was quieter there. The school counselor, Mrs. Bennett, stopped me in the hallway one afternoon and gently asked if I wanted to talk. I told her I was fine before she could finish the sentence. Fine became my favorite lie. At home, my mother acted like my sadness offended her personally. If she caught me looking at old pictures of myself, she would sigh dramatically and say, "Imagine how Madison feels looking in the mirror every day." If I wore a hat indoors, she accused me of being ashamed of my sister. One evening during dinner, she pushed a bowl of mashed potatoes toward me and said, "Honestly, Evelyn, I thought shaving your head would make you less vain, but apparently not." Madison immediately stared down at her plate after she said it. My father cleared his throat awkwardly but stayed silent like always. That was the thing about my father. He never joined in. He just watched. Sometimes I think that hurt worse. By October, Madison had become almost saint-like in our town. Teachers sent her gift baskets. Girls from school made matching bracelets in support of her recovery. Meanwhile, I walked through those same hallways feeling like some strange shadow standing beside her spotlight. One Friday night, I overheard my mother talking to Aunt Denise in the kitchen while they thought I was upstairs asleep. "People finally pay attention to Madison now," my mother whispered. "For once Evelyn is not the center of everything." I froze halfway down the staircase. My chest tightened so hard I had to grip the railing. Aunt Denise said something too quietly for me to hear, but my mother laughed softly afterward. "Cancer changed this family," she said. "Maybe for the better." I went back upstairs before they could see me listening. In my bedroom, I stood in front of the mirror for a very long time under the weak yellow light above my dresser. Tiny blonde stubble had started growing back across my scalp. I ran my hand over it slowly, remembering the girl I used to be before all this happened. Before every smile in our house started feeling conditional. Before love started sounding like obedience. That night, I made myself a promise while the rest of my family slept peacefully down the hall. The moment I turned 18, I was leaving that house and never looking back. By the time winter arrived in Ohio, I had mastered the art of disappearing without actually leaving a room. I knew how to move quietly through the kitchen while my mother talked endlessly about Madison's next appointment. I knew how to make dinner while my father sat exhausted in his recliner watching sports highlights with the volume too loud because silence made him uncomfortable now. Most importantly, I knew how to keep my face expressionless whenever someone compared me to my sister. Madison is so brave. Madison never complains. Madison has such a beautiful spirit. Every compliment directed at her somehow landed on me like criticism. I stopped arguing months earlier because arguing only made my mother angrier. She had developed a new habit of looking at me with disappointment before I even opened my mouth, as if she expected selfishness from me automatically. One Saturday morning in December, she dragged me to church with her while Madison stayed home resting on the couch under 3 blankets. Snow covered the church parking lot in thick gray slush, and cold wind stung my scalp the second I stepped out of the car. I kept my knit cap pulled low, but inside the fellowship hall an older woman smiled sadly at me and touched my shoulder. "You girls are both so strong," she said gently. "I cannot imagine what your family is going through." Before I could answer, my mother quickly corrected her. "Oh no," she laughed lightly. "Only Madison is actually sick." Evelyn shaved her head for attention. The woman's face changed instantly. Embarrassment. Confusion. Pity. I felt heat crawl into my cheeks while my mother accepted a cup of coffee like she had said something perfectly normal. That was the moment I realized humiliation had become entertainment for her. She enjoyed reducing me in front of people. Back at school after Christmas break, things got worse. My hair had started growing back unevenly, sticking out awkwardly around my ears no matter how hard I flattened it down. One afternoon in gym class, a girl named Kayla asked loudly if I was recovering from prison. Everyone laughed except me. Even the teacher pretended not to hear it. I stopped changing clothes in the locker room after that and started hiding in bathroom stalls before class. At night, I lay awake replaying conversations in my head, trying to understand when exactly my family stopped loving me normally. Maybe it had always been uneven and I was only noticing now. Madison had always been beautiful in the soft, delicate way adults loved. Long eyelashes. Gentle smile. Quiet personality. I had been louder growing up. More stubborn. More athletic. Teachers used words like confident when describing me, while my mother preferred difficult. Looking back, I think she resented how naturally I occupied space. Cancer just gave her permission to erase me openly. One evening in February, I came downstairs to grab water and overheard my parents arguing quietly in the kitchen. "You are too hard on Evelyn," my father said under his breath. I froze near the staircase. My mother let out a cold laugh. "Hard on her? Robert, that girl has spent her whole life needing attention." "She is still our daughter," he replied weakly. There was a long silence before my mother answered. "Madison needs us more." I stood there gripping the banister so tightly my fingers hurt. Not because I was shocked anymore. I was past shock by then. What hurt was how ordinary her words sounded. Like this decision had already been made long ago without me realizing it. I went back upstairs unnoticed and closed my bedroom door softly behind me. Then I sat on the floor beside my bed in the dark, pulling my knees against my chest while snow tapped gently against the window outside. For the first time in my life, I stopped wishing my family would choose me too. I finally understood they never would. Spring arrived slowly that year. The snow melted into dirty puddles along the sidewalks, and tiny green buds appeared on the trees outside my bedroom window, but inside our house everything still felt cold. Madison's treatments were finally working. Her doctors sounded optimistic for the first time in months, and neighbors started bringing over celebration cakes instead of sympathy casseroles. My mother smiled more often now. My father slept through the night again. The tension that had wrapped around our family for almost a year began loosening little by little. Everyone seemed relieved except me. Because as Madison slowly got better, nobody apologized for what they had done to me while she was sick. It was like they expected me to simply move on as if humiliation expired the moment the crisis ended. My hair had grown into a short uneven pixie cut by then. Every morning before school, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror trying to flatten the stubborn pieces sticking out around my ears. Sometimes I barely recognized myself anymore. I used to spend hours braiding my hair before football games or curling it before school dances. Back then, people noticed me when I walked into a room. Now I had perfected the skill of keeping my eyes down in hallways so nobody would start conversations. One Saturday afternoon, Madison came into my room quietly without knocking. That alone felt unusual because we had barely spoken honestly in months. She sat carefully on the edge of my bed wearing gray sweatpants and one of my father's oversized sweatshirts. Her new hair was growing in soft and dark against her scalp. Healthier. Stronger. She looked tired, but alive. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly. I shrugged without looking up from my homework. "Sure." She hesitated for several seconds before speaking again. "Do you hate me?" The question sat heavily between us. Outside, I could hear lawnmowers humming somewhere down the street and kids riding bikes through the neighborhood. Normal sounds. Sounds from families that probably still spoke to each other without walking on broken glass. I do not know, I answered honestly. Madison stared down at her hands. I never wanted you to shave your head. I looked up so quickly my neck hurt. She swallowed hard. I told Mom not to make you do it. For a second, I genuinely could not breathe. Every memory from that salon came rushing back at once. The buzzing clippers. My mother's smile. My father staring at his phone. Then why didn't you say anything? I whispered. Madison's eyes filled with tears immediately. Because everything felt out of control. Mom kept saying we all needed to sacrifice together. She said you were being selfish about your appearance. She wiped her face quickly before continuing. And honestly, Evelyn, I think part of me liked not being the ugly sister anymore. The words hit me harder than I expected because they sounded painfully true. Growing up, adults always compared us without realizing it. Madison was sweet. Evelyn was pretty. Madison was gentle. Evelyn was loud. It was like there had only been room for one of us to shine at a time. I am sorry, she whispered. I really am. I wanted to yell at her. I wanted to tell her she should have protected me. But looking at her sitting there so small and exhausted under the afternoon sunlight, I realized something uncomfortable. Madison had spent the last year trying to survive. My mother had spent the last year trying to control everything. And my father had spent the last year hiding from conflict like always. None of them had noticed me drowning quietly beside them. That night, I lay awake staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to my ceiling from childhood while Madison's words replayed over and over in my head. I never wanted you to shave your head. Which meant my mother had wanted it. Not for support. Not for family unity. Not even for Madison. She had wanted me humbled. Smaller. Less visible. And once I understood that truth, I could never unknow it again. After Madison came into my room that afternoon, something shifted quietly between us. Not enough to fix everything, but enough to crack open the version of our family I had forced myself to believe in for years. Once I understood that my mother had pushed the humiliation further than even Madison wanted, I started noticing things I had ignored before. Small things. Tiny moments that suddenly looked different under better light. The way my mother always corrected me faster than Madison. The way she smiled proudly when Madison stayed quiet but called me dramatic whenever I defended myself. The way she complimented other girls in front of me while acting uncomfortable anytime someone praised my appearance. It was like I had spent my whole life reading the wrong language inside my own house. One evening in early May, my school hosted an awards ceremony for graduating seniors. I had worked harder than ever that year, partly because studying gave me somewhere to hide. Somehow, despite everything, I finished near the top of my class. My guidance counselor nominated me for a statewide academic scholarship, and for the first time in months I felt something close to pride returning quietly inside me. The ceremony took place in the high school auditorium under bright fluorescent lights that made everything look pale and washed out. Parents filled rows of folding chairs while students lined up backstage adjusting dresses and ties. I wore a navy blue dress with long sleeves because my hair was still too short for me to feel beautiful in anything else. Madison had insisted on helping me curl the tiny strands around my face before we left home that night. It looks cute, she said softly while standing behind me in the bathroom mirror. I almost cried hearing kindness from her again. During the ceremony, my principal announced my name for the scholarship nomination, and people applauded politely while I walked across the stage trying not to trip in my heels. For one brief second, standing under those stage lights, I felt visible again. Not pitted. Not mocked. Just visible. But afterward in the school lobby, while teachers congratulated me and parents shook my hand, I overheard my mother talking to another woman near the refreshment table. Evelyn has always needed achievements to feel special, she said with a tight smile. Madison is the truly resilient one though. Cancer gave her real perspective. The woman nodded sympathetically while glancing toward Madison, who stood quietly near the punch bowl wearing a scarf over her growing curls. My chest sank instantly. Even here. Even tonight. I stood there holding my scholarship certificate while my mother reduced me to a competition I had never asked to enter. On the drive home, nobody mentioned the ceremony. My father focused on the road. Madison stared out the passenger window. I sat in the back seat clutching the certificate folder against my chest while streetlights flashed across the windows every few seconds. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing inside me for months. Why do you hate me? The silence afterward felt endless. My father tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Madison slowly turned around in her seat. My mother let out a tired sigh like I had inconvenienced her. I do not hate you, Evelyn, she said flatly. I just wish you would stop making everything about yourself. I looked down at the certificate in my lap then slowly closed the folder. Because in that moment, I realized something painful. No matter what I accomplished, my mother would always rewrite the story until I became the selfish one and someone else became the victim. And suddenly, leaving home no longer felt like rebellion. It felt like survival. The summer after graduation felt strangely quiet, like our family had exhausted itself emotionally and no longer knew how to speak to one another without conflict hiding underneath every sentence. Madison continued getting stronger. Her hair had grown into soft dark curls around her face, and neighbors constantly commented on how healthy she looked now. My mother loved hearing that. She practically glowed whenever someone praised Madison's recovery story. Meanwhile, I spent most of my time working double shifts at a small diner off Interstate 71, saving every dollar I could before college started in the fall. The diner smelled like burnt coffee, maple syrup, and fried onions no matter what time of day it was. I loved it there because nobody knew me as the bald girl with the sick sister. To customers, I was just Evelyn, the quiet waitress with tired eyes who always remembered extra ranch dressing without being asked. There was comfort in that kind of invisibility. One afternoon during a slow lunch shift, my manager Carla leaned against the counter while refilling sugar dispensers and asked if I was excited about college. A little, I admitted. Mostly nervous. She smiled warmly. Nervous means you care. That is usually a good sign. I remember almost crying right there beside the pie display because it had been so long since an adult spoke to me gently without making me feel like a burden first. At home, my mother treated my upcoming move to college like an inconvenience instead of an achievement. Every conversation somehow returned to Madison. Do not expect us to help much financially, she reminded me repeatedly. Your sister still has medical expenses. I never argued. I had already accepted that asking for emotional support from my parents was like knocking on a locked door hoping it might suddenly open someday. Still, part of me secretly hoped leaving home would soften things between us. Maybe distance would help. Maybe once I was gone, my mother would finally miss me enough to see me clearly. The night before I moved into my dorm at Ohio State, I sat cross-legged on my bedroom floor packing thrift store towels and cheap notebooks into cardboard boxes while rain tapped softly against the windows. My hair finally brushed my shoulders again for the first time since the salon. I kept touching it absent-mindedly while folding clothes, still amazed it had grown back at all. Around midnight, Madison knocked quietly on my open door. She carried 2 mugs of hot chocolate with tiny marshmallows floating on top. Thought you might still be awake, she said softly. We sat on the floor together surrounded by half-packed boxes while thunder rolled somewhere far away outside. I am proud of you, she told me after a long silence. The words hit me harder than I expected. I stared down at my mug because I suddenly could not trust my face. Thanks, I whispered. Madison twisted the sleeve of her sweatshirt nervously. I know things have been messed up between us. That is one way to put it. She gave a sad little laugh. Mom has always compared us. I used to think if I stayed quiet enough, she would love me more. I looked over at her then. Did it work? Madison's eyes filled with something painful. No, we sat there in silence after that, two sisters finally understanding the same wound from opposite sides. The next morning, my father loaded my boxes into the trunk while my mother stood in the driveway reminding me not to waste money and not to call home constantly because Madison still needed rest. Before I climbed into the car, she glanced at my shoulder-length hair and said casually, "At least it finally grew back normal." I nodded like the comment did not hurt. Like all the others had not hurt either. But as we pulled away from the curb and my childhood house disappeared slowly in the rearview mirror, I realized something quietly devastating. I was not leaving home feeling loved. I was leaving home feeling relieved. College felt like stepping onto another planet where nobody knew the worst thing that had ever happened to me. My dorm room was tiny and smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old carpet, but it belonged to me. Nobody criticized the way I looked there. Nobody compared me to Madison. Nobody sighed dramatically when I entered a room. For the first few weeks at Ohio State, I kept waiting for someone to humiliate me the way my mother always had. I flinched any time people laughed nearby because part of me automatically assumed I was the joke. Trauma does strange things like that. It teaches your body to expect pain long after the danger has passed. My roommate Jenna was the first person who noticed something was wrong. She came from Chicago, studied political science, and had the kind of loud, confident personality I used to have before everything happened at home. One night while we were eating microwave macaroni at our desks, she looked at me carefully and asked, "Why do you apologize every time you speak?" I laughed awkwardly because I honestly had not realized I was doing it. But after that, I started noticing. Sorry for asking. Sorry for sitting here. Sorry for bothering you. Sorry became another reflex I carried out of my childhood house like invisible luggage. During my sophomore year, I started seeing a counselor at the campus wellness center after waking up crying from stress dreams several nights in a row. Her office had soft yellow lamps and bookshelves full of psychology textbooks that smelled faintly dusty whenever sunlight hit them. During our third session, she asked me a question nobody had ever asked before. When did you first start feeling responsible for other people's comfort? I stared at her silently because the answer felt too big to explain in one sentence. Little by little, therapy forced me to look at my family differently. Not through the version my mother created, but through my own memories. I realized how often my feelings had been dismissed growing up. How quickly my achievements became threats instead of celebrations. How my mother confused control with love so completely that she could no longer tell the difference. Meanwhile, Madison and I slowly rebuilt something fragile between us through occasional phone calls and careful honesty. She stayed close to home while attending community college because her health still required regular checkups. Sometimes she sounded exhausted emotionally in ways that reminded me of myself. One snowy evening during my junior year, she admitted something quietly over the phone while I sat wrapped in blankets beside my dorm window. Mom still talks about you like you abandoned the family. I stared outside at students crossing campus through falling snow. Did I? I asked softly. Madison was quiet for several seconds. No, she finally answered. You escaped. Those words stayed with me for a long time afterward. Escaped. Not left. Not betrayed. Escaped. By the time I graduated with my psychology degree, I barely recognized the frightened 16-year-old girl from the salon anymore. My hair reached halfway down my back again. I cut it however I wanted now. Sometimes short. Sometimes long. Sometimes dyed darker in winter just because I liked the change. Every choice felt quietly rebellious after spending years believing my appearance belonged to someone else's approval. I eventually moved to Cleveland and started working at a trauma recovery center for teenage Girls dealing with anxiety, family instability, and emotional neglect. The irony was not lost on me. I spent my days helping young women rebuild self-worth while still struggling to fully believe in my own. But healing is strange like that. Sometimes you learn how to save yourself by first helping someone else survive. Nearly 12 years passed before I saw my mother again in person. And by then, life had already found a way to humble all of us. 12 years can change a person completely, but somehow one phone call can still make you feel 16 again. I was finishing paperwork at the trauma center one rainy Thursday evening when my phone buzzed with Madison's name across the screen. We talked occasionally by then, mostly on birthdays and holidays, careful conversations built slowly over time like people walking across thin ice. But something in the late hour made my stomach tighten before I even answered. "Hey," I said quietly, leaning back in my office chair while rain tapped against the windows. Madison sounded exhausted. Older somehow. "Mom is sick," she said immediately. I closed my eyes for a second. "How sick?" There was a pause long enough to tell me the answer before she even spoke again. "It is serious." I stared at the framed certificates hanging on my office wall while she explained everything. My mother had been diagnosed with an autoimmune illness that left her constantly fatigued and dependent on medications. My father had retired early after heart problems the year before. Medical bills were piling up. The house felt heavy now, according to Madison. Quiet. Tense. Fragile. I listened without interrupting, surprised by how little anger I felt anymore. Time had not erased the damage, but it had softened the sharpest edges of it. Pain ages too eventually. "She wants to see you," Madison said softly near the end of the call. I laughed once under my breath before I could stop myself. "Does she?" "Evelyn." "Sorry." Rainwater streaked down the dark office windows beside me. Outside, Cleveland traffic crawled slowly through wet streets glowing under yellow streetlights. "I just never thought she would ask." Madison's voice cracked slightly. "Neither did I." 2 weeks later, I drove back to my childhood home for the first time in over a decade. The neighborhood looked smaller than I remembered. The maple tree in our front yard had grown massive, its branches hanging low across the driveway. Even the house itself seemed tired now. The white paint had faded. One shutter hung slightly crooked near the upstairs window. I sat in my car for almost 5 full minutes gripping the steering wheel before finally forcing myself to get out. Madison opened the front door before I could knock. For a second we simply stared at each other quietly. She looked healthy now. Strong. Older around the eyes, but peaceful in a way I had never seen during our teenage years. Then she hugged me tightly without warning. "I am glad you came," she whispered. The house smelled exactly the same. Coffee. Dust. Lavender candles. Memory hit me so hard it almost made me dizzy. My father sat asleep in his recliner facing a muted television while afternoon sunlight filtered through the living room curtains. He looked smaller than I remembered too. Older. Fragile in a way fathers are never supposed to become. When he opened his eyes and saw me standing there, genuine emotion crossed his face so quickly it startled me. "Evie," he said softly, using the nickname nobody had spoken aloud in years. Then came silence again. Thick and awkward. Because none of us knew how to bridge 12 years of distance politely. Madison finally nodded toward the hallway. "She is in her room." My chest tightened instantly. I walked slowly down the same hallway where I used to stand listening to arguments through half-closed doors as a teenager. Family photos still lined the walls. Madison at cheer competitions. Me holding soccer trophies. Christmas mornings frozen inside cheap wooden frames. We looked like a happy family in every picture. That was the strange thing about photographs. They captured smiles perfectly while missing everything happening underneath them. When I reached my parents' bedroom door, my hand hesitated against the frame. Then I looked inside and saw my mother sitting quietly by the window with a blanket over her knees, staring out at the gray afternoon sky. And for the first time in my life, she looked small. My mother turned slowly when she heard me step into the room. For a moment neither of us spoke. The woman sitting beside the window barely resembled the version of her that had lived so powerfully in my memories all these years. Her hair, once carefully highlighted every 6 weeks without fail, had faded almost completely gray. Her hands looked thinner resting against the blanket on her lap. Even her posture seemed quieter somehow, as if life itself had finally pressed down hard enough to bend her. "Hello, Evelyn," she said softly. I nodded once. "Hi, Mom." The silence that followed felt strangely calm instead of tense. Maybe because I was no longer 16 years old waiting for her approval. I pulled a chair closer and sat across from her while late afternoon sunlight stretched across the carpet between us. Outside the window, wind moved gently through the maple tree branches. "Madison said you wanted to see me," I said carefully. My mother looked down at her hands for several seconds before answering. "I did." Her voice sounded weaker than I remembered, but still controlled. Still careful. "You look well." "I am." Another silence. Then she surprised me. "Your hair is beautiful." I almost laughed at the irony of it. Instead, I reached up absent-mindedly and tucked part of it behind my ear. It had grown long again over the years, soft waves falling nearly to the middle of my back now. For so long I thought growing it back would heal something inside me. But healing turned out to be much quieter than that. "Thank you," I said politely. My mother stared toward the window again. "I know you think I failed you." The sentence landed gently between us, almost careful enough to miss the pain underneath it. I sat very still. "I do not think that," I answered honestly. "I know it." She closed her eyes briefly at that. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just tired. "Back then," she whispered, "I was terrified of losing Madison." "I know." Everything felt out of control. I nodded slowly because I understood fear now in ways I could not as a teenager. I had spent years counseling frightened people. I understood. Panic. Grief. Emotional survival. But understanding pain and excusing cruelty were not the same thing. "You shaved my head because you were scared," I said quietly. "But you kept humiliating me long after the fear passed." Tears gathered slowly in her eyes then. Real tears. Not manipulative ones. "I thought making you smaller would make things easier for this family," she admitted weakly. "You were always so bright. So confident. And Madison always seemed so fragile beside you." Hearing her finally say it out loud felt strangely empty after all those years. Not triumphant. Not satisfying. Just sad. Because the truth was smaller than the damage it created. "I spent years believing I was hard to love," I told her softly. "Do you understand that?" My mother looked down immediately. "Yes. I spent years apologizing for existing." Her mouth trembled slightly. "I know." I studied her quietly then. The woman who had once controlled every emotional temperature inside our house now looked exhausted by her own memories. And suddenly I realized something important. I did not need revenge anymore. Life had already humbled all of us differently. My father moved slower now. Madison carried scars no one could see. My mother sat wrapped in blankets watching the world through windows instead of controlling it. And me? I survived them. That was enough. I stood slowly and walked toward the bedroom door before stopping one final time. "You know what the strangest part is?" I said without turning around. Losing my hair was never the thing that hurt most. My mother stayed silent behind me. I rested my hand lightly against the doorframe. It was learning that the people who were supposed to protect me needed me to feel ugly in order to feel comfortable themselves. Then I walked out of the room quietly, leaving the door open behind me for the first time in my life.